Hi, this is Brock Dickinson, and I'm coming to you today from the region of Niagara in Canada. And I wanted to take a little bit more of a philosophical bent today to kind of explore some of the political philosophy behind the current trade war and tariff discussions. People joke that men think about the Roman Empire on a regular basis. This isn't quite at that level, but I do want to think today about the Holy Roman Empire, which is a different beast entirely. This is the kind of imperial structure that grew up in Central Europe in the late Middle Ages and involved places that we know today as Austria and Hungary and Germany and Czechia and Poland, etc. This region became the focal point of what was known as the 30 Years' War. This lasted from 1618 to 1648, hence the name 30 Years. And the 30 Years' War is one of those historic conflicts that continues to have some pretty substantial repercussions for the modern world. And in large part, that's related to the peace treaty that ended that war. It's known as the Peace of Westphalia, and it was signed in 1648. And a lot of what we understand about today's modern international system actually emerged as a result of the Peace of Westphalia. Part of that, for example, is that nations became the dominant structure within the political system. So prior to the Peace of Westphalia, we had things like city leagues, like the Hanseatic League, for example, where cities, if they declared independence, were essentially regarded as equal to nation states. We also had other forms of organization like the Vatican, religious authority. And in fact, the Vatican was not just this little postage stamp sized territory in the middle of Italy. It owned and controlled territories all across Europe. It was the political authority in those areas and not just a religious authority. The Peace of Westphalia said enough of all of this. The only people who are allowed to be part of the international system are nation states. And it introduced the notion of the comity of nations, this idea that there was a kind of an association or a grouping or a coming together of similarly structured political animals that allowed mutual recognition to take hold. And so city leagues, city states, religious structures were excluded from that process, and the international system began to be seen as something that existed for countries, for states only. That led to a related idea known as juridical equivalence. And juridical equivalence basically says that, well, if we're all states and we're all equal in this structure, we need to kind of recognize each other's systems to some extent. So if I go and get married in the United Kingdom and then I move to France, it doesn't mean my marriage is dissolved, that the laws and the sort of administrative structures might be different, but a marriage in the UK is the equivalent of a marriage in France because of juridical equivalence, that all countries are seen as equal in the eyes of the law. And this has led to a really interesting series of undertakings over the last 350 years because that juridical equivalence has essentially created a structure in which nation states can do deals with each other. Why? Because their legal systems are regarded as being somewhat equal, and therefore what is legally binding in one context can be legally binding across the border in another context as well. So for example, when you sign a trade agreement, how do you know that it's going to be valid? Because you've got two different sets of laws at play. Well, juridical equivalence says it doesn't matter the specifics of the law. The fact is that you can kind of make this a legal document, a legal agreement within both jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions see each other's agreements as equivalent to each other in this international space. You can see where this starts to play into the context of tariffs, and in the Trump tariffs in particular. We seem to be undermining the concept of juridical equivalence. A deal that gets signed at one point can be thrown out as long as the nation throwing it out is stronger and more powerful. So, for example, President Trump can negotiate the USMCA, the Free Trade Agreement for North America, and then a few years later decide that he doesn't like it anymore, and so just toss it out the window because he's a bigger, stronger, more powerful nation than the Canadians or the Mexicans who signed that deal with him. He's not required to acknowledge juridical equivalence, that all three legal systems are of equal value and that an agreement is grounded in all three of those systems. He's only acknowledging that the US has the bigger military, the bigger economy, the bigger stick, and therefore can do whatever it wants. This approach, of course, undermines that concept of juridical equivalence. It says that the biggest player in the room gets to call the shots whenever and however they want. And that may be fine, but it does suggest that negotiating agreements is impossible in that sort of a context, because you cannot trust the bigger or more powerful player to stick by the agreements that it negotiates. If it can abrogate or reverse its decisions on a whim, then why on earth would you enter into an agreement in the first place? And so if might makes right, rather than a juridical equivalence creating equality, it means that all international agreements suddenly become suspect. And there's no point to negotiating trade deals or trade arrangements in that context, because they can be torn up tomorrow or next week or next month, depending on the whims of the stronger administration or the stronger government. And so there's this philosophy at the heart of the Trump tariffs that is undermining its own intent. The notion here is that President Trump wants to get deals. He wants to be able to negotiate better opportunities for the United States. But to do that, he's tearing up the existing deals and saying, oh, we don't have to follow those rules anymore. And that inherent contradiction is a part of what undermines the international negotiation process in its entirety. This same philosophy is what's hampering peace negotiations with Russia and Ukraine. It's driving confusion over what's going on the trade front. And it means that moving forward, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to negotiate international agreements, whether that's with other countries, whether that's with other companies, or whether that's even with individual investors. In a world where might makes right, I don't want to risk the notion that somebody might change their minds about the deal they made in a week's time or a month's time or a year's time. And so I'm going to keep my resources closer to home. I'm going to invest them in markets that do offer me some level of comfort and security, and therefore I'm not likely to pursue the kind of a policy or approach that President Trump imagines will result from the tariff regime.